So the worst lie is that LDL is bad. It's the major cause of heart disease. And because of that lie, cereal manufacturers, big food is saying, buy our stuff. Your LDL is going to go down. Your cholesterol is going to get better. But they don't tell you that you're going to get fat, sick, and addicted. Is lie a harsh word? A misperception? Maybe just a misunderstanding? Or maybe more accurately, a debatable point? Maybe we're using more of a clickbait type of wording. No. Since you started watching this video, someone else just died from heart attack. In the U.S. alone, there's a heart attack every 33 seconds. There's a stroke every 40 seconds. To that person that died from cardiovascular disease, that person that just had a stroke, to his family or her family, do you think it matters whether it's a lie or a misunderstanding or debate? They just want it to stop. The biggest lie or misunderstanding, debatable point, whatever you want to call it, that's causing patients and doctors to rely on the wrong treatment, medication. That's the problem with this lie. Instead of the right treatment, metabolic reset, they rely on a pill when the real treatment is changing their metabolism. Another problem with this lie is that the pill most doctors rely on, usually high-dose statins, have significant side effects. So we're talking about statins. The strategy's been shown to be absolutely ineffective. We've had 5 decades of trying statins. It hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse. So you tell me, are statins the answer? But hey, Big Pharma's still making a lot of money. Duh. Who doesn't think that? The reality is, promoting lifestyle is just not as lucrative as cereal or pills. Just take a look at these numbers. General Mills, the makers of Cheerios, sold about 139 million boxes. 139 million boxes of Cheerios alone. And they earned $20 billion in just 2023. $20 billion, not million, billion, in 1 year alone. Last year, 2023. And the result is, this result's coming from, again, those two assumptions, that high cholesterol is the cause of heart attacks and strokes. That's why everybody's worried about it. And next, the second assumption, that cereal actually decreases cholesterol and is therefore good for your heart. Both statements are just flat wrong. The bottom line is, eating these types of cereals is like saving pennies at the cost of dollars. So, how did we get to this point? How come everyone, including the medical community, the vast majority of the medical community, concluded that LDL is the cause of heart attacks? LDL's not even cholesterol. Yep, you heard me right. LDL is actually a particle called a lipoprotein. Hang in there. We're going to get geeky for just a couple of minutes, but it'll make a big difference in terms of your understanding later on. Lipoprotein. Lipo means fat or oil. Protein means protein. A lipoprotein is a particle made of fat and protein. Lipoproteins are like unique little submarines. They transport fat, triglycerides, and cholesterol. Why do we have them? I always keep this little demonstration. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a bottle of water with oil on top. You can shake it up, and it sort of mixes, but not really. Very quickly, we begin to see that oil comes on the top. In other words, as we all know, oil and water don't mix. So what happens when you eat something like a salad with olive oil and you digest it and that olive oil goes into your bloodstream, which is over 95% water? They wouldn't mix and you'd get that big blob, and that big blob could kill you, just like a heart attack or stroke. So your body creates a solution. The solution is lipoproteins. It makes proteins that keep these oils protected in microscopic particles. That's what lipoproteins are. So thank you for hanging in there with that geek demonstration. The two smallest and densest of the lipoproteins are HDL and LDL. That used to be called good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. High-density lipoprotein and low-density lipoprotein. Remember density. The more fat, the lower the density, because fat floats, protein doesn't. Here's the deeper geeky part. There are far bigger, very low density lipoproteins. And hang in there, VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. It carries a lot more fat in it. Triglyceride, not so much cholesterol. IDL, it carries a lot more fat, not necessarily cholesterol, but triglyceride and chylomicron remnant. So the biggest, the fattest, the one with the most triglyceride is the chylomicron remnant. It drops off some of that triglyceride. When it does, it gets smaller and a little bit more dense. It turns into a VLDL. And guess what? The VLDL drops off more of that triglyceride because it's dropping off fat. It's getting smaller and denser. It turns into IDL. The IDL drops off more fat, more triglyceride. When it does, it becomes, you guessed it, something that's a little bit more dense, but significantly smaller. It's dropped off fat, and it becomes the LDL. So you have that cascade, and those bigger particles, LDL all the way up to remnant cholesterol, are called ApoB. We'll talk about that just a little bit later. Now, if you think cholesterol and triglycerides in the blood are bad, and that LDL cholesterol is also bad, think again. You need both of these. Cholesterol plays a major role in creating vitamin D and other hormones. It is critical for bile acids, but here's a key item. The brain is a major user of cholesterol. It's mostly cholesterol. Muscle cells use cholesterol. Our liver makes more cholesterol than we'll ever eat because our body needs it. You think triglycerides are bad? Think again. Triglycerides are our body's most efficient way to take on, transport, store, and burn energy. In fact, you can compare carbs and triglycerides. Think about our body as a hybrid machine. We burn two different major fuels, carbohydrates and triglycerides. Carbohydrates are sort of like throwing pine needles on a campfire. They flash up quickly, they're easy to catch on fire, but then they burn out quickly and they junk up the campfire with their ashes. Think of triglycerides as more like a log. It's harder to get that log started, but once you get that log started, triglycerides or logs burn cleaner, they burn longer, you don't have these big blood sugar swings, and it doesn't junk up the system. Just realize that metabolic disease is an imbalance in how we burn our hybrid machine, how we burn triglycerides, how we burn carbs. In fact, simply put, up at about 10,000 feet, it starts with insulin resistance. Because insulin's critical to getting sugar out of the blood into the cells, we start having problems burning carbs. Because our body's resisting that insulin, the insulin goes up and up and up. One thing that most people don't know, and it's critical to this process, high insulin stops fat burning. So what starts off as a simple problem with insulin resistance turns into a problem burning carbs, and then into a problem burning fats. So now you can't burn either one very well. So let's go back to the cholesterol triglyceride issue. Since metabolic disease is really the issue for 80%, maybe 90%, think about this comparison of LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol is occasionally a marker for metabolic disease, but not a good one at all. Triglycerides are far more important. They're far more significant in understanding cardiovascular disease risk. Now let's talk about LDL and plaque. One thing that is true, LDL particles, and specifically the small, dense, and oxidized LDL particles, do get inside the plaques. They become part of the cardiovascular plaque. After all, arterial plaque does have fat in it. Fat is not debated. Nobody should argue about that. But here's the debate. The current claim is it's about what started that plaque. And the current claim is that LDL particles are the major cause, even the only cause. They cause inflammation and plaque buildup. Again, that's wrong. The theory is that a traffic jam caused by LDL particles, small dense particles, is stuck in your artery and causes plaque. Small LDL particle traffic jam is not the problem. Cholesterol itself is not the problem. As before, triglyceride is, and metabolic disease. But this is not just the LDL particles. The trigger is metabolic disease. LDL and other lipoprotein particles, now they are affected by metabolic disease and sometimes can be good, if not great, biomarkers. But they're not the cause, and LDL is a terrible biomarker. The lipidology community is now acknowledging that LDL is not the issue. After all of this, just over the past few years, they've got a new villain, ApoB. ApoB, according to the theory, is now the number one marker to follow, and it is causing the damage. ApoB is a kind of a tag for the lipoproteins that we discussed earlier. So those bigger, fattier particles that are storing and using triglycerides, those are ApoB. So when you understand that this is metabolic disease and you've got to build up too much triglyceride, yes, you could say that the lipidologists have a point. ApoB is better than LDL alone as a biomarker. But here's the problem. Neither one of those is the cause. The treatment is not medication, it's lifestyle change. And we've got such better ways to evaluate metabolic disease. Now, focusing on plaque really starts leading us towards plumbing. And that's a slippery slope. And yes, you heard me right. I said plumbing. Pipes and clearing pipes. We have to talk about that because that's the standard now. Think of it as pipes and you're doing plumbing. Now, if you pay your bills by doing plumbing, then you're going to believe in plumbing. And again, by plumbing, I'm not talking about your house. I'm talking about stents, stress tests, and going to the cath lab. Yes, I'm talking about your cardiologist. So be careful when somebody recommends those things. Again, let's go back and think about it. We've had decades of statins. We've had decades of plumbing, stents, stress tests, cath labs. Has it gotten better? Has it cured the disease? It's gotten worse. Everybody in cardiology leadership, I'm talking about American boards of internal medicine, I'm talking about internal medicine societies, I'm talking about the standards committees for the American Heart Association, they all say the same thing. Over half of stress tests are medically totally inappropriate. And I'm going to say something else. It's really more like 90%. This is not a plumbing problem. It's a metabolic problem. I'm not saying LDL and ApoB don't matter. I'm saying they are very, very small on the list of things that cause the problems. Meanwhile, 3/4 of doctors in this country, the U.S., don't know how to diagnose what does matter. What is metabolic disease? So if not LDL, not ApoB, not plumbing, again, what is it? And you know where I'm going. I've already tipped my hand. It's metabolic disease. Let's go back to some basics and some history to help understand what metabolic disease is. We actually, a couple of decades ago, used to call it metabolic syndrome. And it will help us to look at that old definition of metabolic syndrome because we did have ideas about what was important, what caused the disease, and most importantly, what did not. So we noticed that we, meaning doctors decades ago, noticed that different conditions combined significantly increase the risk of building plaque, causing heart attacks and strokes and the death and disability associated with it. Now, what were those conditions? Let's list them, talk about them for a few minutes, and you'll see what's important in terms of driving heart attack and stroke. And again, you'll see what's missing. That's a key tip. First of all, obesity. Next, high blood pressure. Next, high triglycerides. Next, low HDL. Next, protein in the urine. And finally, insulin resistance. Did you notice what's not there? We'll talk about that in just a minute, but let's go into a little bit more detail on each of these components because they matter. The World Health Organization says you're in trouble if your body mass index exceeds 30. I know some of you are sitting there saying, BMI is terrible, I've got a lot of muscle, and sure enough, you can have a healthy body composition at a BMI of 30. If you looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger did the day he won Mr. Olympia. Otherwise, you need to think about it. And again, I understand. I use DEXA. I got my own DEXA scan, and it's far, far better than BMI. For those of you who are curious, yes, I have 20% body fat. That's a good number. And my visceral fat varies between a half a pound and a pound. That's also a very good number. Let's get back to BMI, because most people are not going to get a DEXA scan. Body fat drives hormones like resistin and neuropeptide Y. Body fat cell needs to have a shutoff valve. Here's what the body fat cell does. It takes in blood sugar from the blood, and turns it into fat for storage and use later on for cleaner burning. But a fat cell can get too full. When it does, it gets very unhealthy. It has a shutdown mechanism, and it's called resistin. Resistin is a hormone that it makes, and it says, I'm resisting insulin now. It works great. It doesn't bring in sugar from the blood anymore. But here's the problem with resistin. It doesn't work for just that body's fat cell. It works for all the other body fat cells. It also works for your liver, and it works for your muscles. So now nothing is responding to insulin. Does that start to ring bells and help you understand how fat contributes to insulin resistance? Another key thing to look at is visceral fat. I mentioned that before. One parameter is 10%. Another parameter is the actual number of pounds. Like I said, mine goes from half a pound to a pound. That's a really good number. So if you have that information, you don't have to worry about your BMI. Body fat, especially visceral fat, is a far better marker than BMI alone. And if you can measure body fat, get a DEXA scan. I clearly recommend it. If you can't, you can try measuring your waist. For men, 35 inches or less, specifically less. And yes, mine varies between 32 and 33. For women, the lower number, 31 or less. And pants size does not count unless you bring your pants up around your belly button. And that's just not the style these days. So we've talked a lot about obesity as a driver of metabolic syndrome. Let's go to something else, blood pressure. Far more important than LDL. High blood pressure is a big problem. It can damage vessels throughout the body, including the heart, the brain, the lungs, the eyes, and the kidneys. I recommend aiming for a blood pressure of less than 120/80 and try to keep it a little bit higher than 90/60 at least. Number 3, triglycerides. We need triglycerides to transport and use energy. Remember we said that is fat and it burns clean like a log, unless you've got too much insulin keeping you from burning it. With metabolic disease, we lose our ability to burn triglycerides very well. We begin to store excess triglycerides, unburned. And guess where we store that? Yep, these saddlebags on our hips, our thighs, our belly. And guess what? There's a place that we store them more, and most doctors don't even understand it. You remember those particles? Yes, those lipoprotein particles. And you remember those big fat-laden ones? IDL, VLDL, and chylomicron? Those things keep coming back. And that's where tons of these get stored, and you don't want to have a lot of those. The triglyceride-filled cholesterol particles. They cause inflammation. They cause plaque, even if your ApoB numbers are actually low. The standard recommendation to keep your blood triglycerides is less than 150. But I can tell you, that's too high. I recommend shooting for less than 100. Now, how do you manage that? Again, lifestyle. Number 4. HDL stands for high-density lipoprotein. We've talked about it. Remember that the lower the triglycerides in lipoprotein particles, the better. HDL has the least triglyceride. The role of HDL is to connect with LDL, get some of that cargo, the triglycerides and cholesterol, and bring it back to the liver. But that's a little bit confusing. You don't need to worry so much about that. Do remember this. HDL can even pass through the layers of the artery wall to remove inflammatory triglycerides. It helps in plaque reversal. It cleans things up. Triglycerides inside of HDL will not cause more plaque, since they're already on the way back to the liver to be recycled and burned. The recommendation for HDL cholesterol is above 40 for men and above 50 for women. And again, as you always keep seeing, my standards are higher. I'd much rather see 50 or higher in men. Now, you have a higher risk factor when your triglyceride over HDL ratio is above 2. Remember, we've talked about triglycerides and HDL. And you want HDL high, triglycerides low. Now, if you paid attention, early on I said HDL cholesterol, which measures the cholesterol inside the HDL particles and the HDL particles themselves. I like to measure that particle. I like to measure the large components of those particles. People with HDL large, higher levels, tend to have much better metabolic health. Again, how do you do that? Lifestyle. Number 5, microalbuminuria. Now, wait a minute. What's that tongue twister? Well, it's a great test to measure protein in your urine and therefore damage to the smaller vessels. You thought I was going to say kidneys, and yes, it's important to kidneys, and yes, the smaller vessels in the kidneys, but the small vessels are lined with the same thing. Our arteries are lined with a lining called an intima. If that lining gets inflamed, you see protein in the urine. So micro means small, albumin is protein, urea means urine. Albumin is just not supposed to be in the urine. It's supposed to be filtered to stay in the blood. Now, when you have metabolic disease, which means a lot of cardiovascular inflammation, your kidney filter starts getting damaged and letting through proteins like albumin. WHO, World Health Organization, they're saying keep the urine albumin to less than 20 micrograms. But I go even further, and if you're not a WHO fan, that's okay. The point is that many of the biomarkers that I use are known. They have standards for them. They're listed, and unfortunately, most docs just haven't connected the dots to understand metabolic disease and the biomarkers associated with them. I use a specific ratio. We compare albumin to creatinine, a protein that's found in healthy urine. We get a ratio of those two. A ratio above 3 is an early sign of cardiovascular inflammation and usually metabolic disease. I use other unique inflammation markers. Let us know in the comments if you want a video about them. Right now, let's continue to focus on metabolic disease. Now, even the WHO recognizes one key player. The player is neglected every single day by most doctors when they're talking about heart attack prevention. And no, you've guessed it, it's not LDL. It's not ApoB. It's not any type of cholesterol. It's a critical marker necessary to meet the definition. It's actually a disease mechanism. The definition of metabolic disease requires insulin resistance. Insulin resistance involves a poor response from your organs, your tissues, your cells to insulin, the receptors in those cells. Insulin does a lot of things. The major one is helping glucose pass from the blood where it can damage artery walls, the lining of the artery walls, into the cells where it's safe. The key thing is that very few people know high insulin stops fat burning. We mentioned that before when we were talking about the mechanism of metabolic disease. There's a great book called Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. It was by a fellow named Gary Taubes. It's a core original book about insulin resistance. And in that book, he says, we think we get fat because we're eating more. It's really actually the opposite, and it twists a lot of people in terms of their logic. He said, we're eating more because we're getting fat, and we're getting fat because we cannot burn our calories. We can't burn our carbs, and we can't burn our triglyceride. So again, in metabolic disease, blood sugar goes up. Insulin goes up. High insulin stops fat burning. Now, let's go back and talk about the causes of insulin resistance, since that's the major driving force. Genetics, it runs in families. There's no question or argument about that. Aging and too much body fat. Aging is the major driver of metabolic disease and insulin resistance. Not going to go down that path, not going to debate it because it's really not worth it. But let's think about something that is very practical. You've got those 3 things, genetics, aging, and too much body fat. Which of those 3 can you change if you have this problem? You obviously cannot change your genetics. You obviously cannot change your age. But if you've got too much body fat, it ain't easy, but you can change that. So what if you're my age and you have insulin resistance, but you don't have excess body fat? are significant amounts. What do you do? Well, it's more complicated. Those of us 65 and older start getting more and more of this. One of the major focus points should be development of metabolically active muscle. People talk about muscle mass, so they want to grow and get heavier again. It's not so much muscle mass, it's the amount of mitochondria in that muscle. And again, exercise is important, but you cannot outrun a diet problem. And again, we can cover this in other videos. This video has a lot in it. When our typical patient first sees us, she or he has already lost 30 pounds or more. That's very common for our practice. You cannot effectively control fat while eating too many carbs and sugars. So how do they do this? Again, we hear it over and over again. First, I stopped eating carbs. That decreased the insulin level. And again, now when I get a decreased insulin level, I can start burning fat. It's just pure physiology and hormones. If you think hormones aren't powerful, try raising a teenager. You cannot control your weight with too much of this hormone, insulin, in your blood. You just can't do it. Let's talk about sugar for a minute. Processed carbs are the worst, and therefore things like cereals, full of processed carbs, nothing but processed carbs, 50 grams of processed carbs in the cereal itself, all of which hit your blood sugar immediately. And that's not even counting the milk or the orange juice. Those are major problems. And for most diets, they're even bigger than sugars like sucrose and fructose. But all of them are bad. They stimulate insulin, and high insulin does what? It stops fat burning. Elevated insulin alone is inflammatory. Even when you combine insulin with glucose, high glucose in your blood, that's a recipe for burning arteries day after day. And we routinely see people with decades of damage to their arteries. When you consider that level of damage, it's amazing that arteries are as resilient as they actually are. Plaque and inflammation are your body's response to this continued bathing with sugar and insulin. All of carb diets are the recipe for heart attacks and strokes. Now, there is a need for clarification. Traditional medical care docs do recognize the importance of diabetes. It's not that they don't know that diabetes is there, or, well, sort of. When somebody has severe diabetes, they know it rots their arteries. But here's where the problem is with traditional medicine, traditional doctors. They don't recognize it as the primary driver of metabolic disease and plaque. Second, by the time somebody gets diagnosed with diabetes, years or even decades on average have already passed by with damage in vessels, including plaque buildup. Doctors just don't diagnose diabetes in time to avoid damage. Again, that's not me saying that. Go to Mayo, go to Hopkins. Multiple academic centers have documented 3/4 of primary care doctors don't know how to diagnose prediabetes. We're not talking about orthopedists. We're not talking about neurosurgeons. We're talking about family practitioners, internists, and cardiologists, the doctors whom the vast majority of us depend on to keep us from having a heart attack or stroke. Now, you think I'm overemphasizing prediabetes and diabetes. Well, those of you who love to hate on the CDC, I'm going to quote them for a second. They recognize 52%, over half of Americans 18 and older have either diabetes or prediabetes. And again, if you don't want to trust the CDC, you don't have to. This is a large database. The National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It's part of the U.S. Census. They actually take a subset and they do examinations and even lab tests, all of which acknowledge that over half of adults in the U.S. alone have prediabetes or diabetes. And you know what? The lab test they used was A1C, or fasting glucose, which the ADA, American Diabetes Association, admits misses over half of prediabetes and diabetes. So even with faulty, poor testing, over half of adult Americans have this problem, prediabetes. Guess what portion of American adults are aware that they have the problem? 10%. So, you think I'm pushing this point too hard? Again, it's what's killing us. we're depending on our doctors to help us find it, and they're failing. And we're failing. If you're going to depend on your doctor to find this, you are failing. So please stop doing that. And let's start thinking about there's a huge opportunity here. And that is to learn this information and fix it. One of the first things I ask when I see a patient is, have you been diagnosed with diabetes or prediabetes? Most patients say, no, I got tested and it was negative for diabetes. Again, here's the problem. The main test used for diabetes is A1C. The other test that's used is fasting glucose. Again, together they miss, I would say, way over half of this disease. Let me just say this. I realize that discussion of prediabetes, diabetes, and especially testing for it can become confusing. You can get these lab tests on your own. If you'd like help, we're there at 859-721-1414. The definitive test is called a glucose challenge test. It can be called OGTT, oral glucose tolerance test. It's not fun, but I recommend doing it once a year because as we age, that insulin resistance gets worse and worse. You can get fasting glucose numbers, drink a 75-gram glucose solution, and then test again at a half hour, 1 hour, and 2 hours. So let me give you some optimal numbers for fasting 1 hour and 2 hours. 90 or less, 120 or less, and 100 or less. But you may think about it. So what if I'm able to control those blood sugars by just pumping out more insulin? If you're thinking that, your logic is excellent. That's exactly what a fellow named Joseph Kraft said, and he developed a thing called the Kraft Insulin Survey. All you do there is measure the amount of insulin at each of those periods. So what's the best numbers for insulin? At fasting or basal insulin, 5 or less. At 1 hour, 50 or less. And at 2 hours, 40 or less. Now, I'm going to just talk about some other risk factors. Number 1, autoimmune diseases. Hypothyroidism, which is usually an autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, lupus. Those are all major risk factors for metabolic syndrome. Number 2, blood diseases like thalassemia, iron metabolism problems. Number 3, atrial fibrillation. It's a condition with genetic predisposition. It can increase the risk of stroke by 5 to 8 times. It's very important to be aware of it. Number 4, sleep apnea. It increases the risk for high blood pressure, for metabolic disease, and for other problems. Number 6, environmental problems. Air and food pollution causing metabolic disease? Yes, they do. Malnutrition. Multiple vitamin and nutrition deficiencies can increase the risk of plaque buildup. Vitamin B12 to vitamin D to anemia, a lack of iron, or even too much iron. So you can tell how complex cardiovascular prevention can be. But to get back to the simple part, for the vast majority of us, it's metabolic disease. That's why we covered it in depth. I do want to talk about another component, LDL and ApoB. Now, there are times, it's relatively rare, when LDL and ApoB make a big difference in terms of actually causing cardiovascular disease, not just being a biomarker. And that's for people with familial hypercholesterolemia. A case has to be made for LDL and ApoB. There's an outlier population. It does have an increased risk of heart attack or stroke, directly related to LDL. I've got a lot of FH patients in my practice. If you're watching this, don't panic. Listen to the end. People with FH, they tend to have LDL levels 180 and above. Now, here's the thing, though. The vast majority of FH patients are what we call heterozygous. That means they got one gene from either mom or dad. They have relatively little risk. It's when they start getting metabolic disease that they start having problems. But think about homozygous. Now, that means they got a gene from mom and a gene from dad. The frequency of seeing heterozygous is about 1 in 300 to 1 in 500. Homozygous, on the other hand, means lightning struck twice in the same place. It's like 1 in 170 to 300,000 or more. It's rare. These people lost the genetics lottery. They do not have even a single healthy gene for metabolizing LDL cholesterol. So a homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia patient, yes, these people can have heart attacks in their 20s and even teens. So for them, LDL and ApoB do appear to be the major risk factor. In fact, if you go way back in history, it was these unique cases that made doctors go down the path of thinking LDL is the major driver. They saw heart attacks in teenagers and 20-year-olds. They found this extremely high LDL, and they said, oh, LDL is the problem. And then they saw the biomarker correlates with LDL and metabolic disease. If you cover that, you sort of have to cover lean mass hyperresponders. It's another population that's becoming more and more popular. Well, more and more common. We've known about them for decades. Some people, when they drop their carbs and go on a keto diet, their LDL shoots up. Now, the official definition is triglycerides below 70 and HDL above 80. These people have little or no metabolic disease. Interestingly, though, LDL shoots to 180, 200, or above. The key thing is they're on a low-carb or keto diet. Now, what happens with this population? Obviously, they've got some genetic variations as well, but the question is that high LDL actually causing plaque? Or recently, there was a study which shows probably not. They took 100 lean mass hyperresponders and compared them to other people in the Miami Heart Study. After 4 years of a ketogenic diet, these people had I think it was an average LDL of like 250. It was 1 in 1,000 LDL levels. And these people did not have more plaque. So again, that raises the question, what actually is going on with LDL and what does it do? So here's my perspective on that. It's not black and white. Everybody's different. We all have our own genetics, our own metabolic makeup, and it's important to personalize medical recommendations. I'll tell you what I've seen in my experience. I've seen that most people who are able to control their metabolic disease reach their goals of a healthy lifespan. All the other markers I've shown in the video, even moderately elevated LDL and ApoB, just don't show significant inflammation. But before I recommend medication, here's what I recommend as the approach to prevent heart attacks and strokes. Let's start off with what I don't recommend. I don't recommend heart-healthy cereal. I don't recommend any processed foods. I don't recommend high-dose statins. I don't recommend injecting insulin, and I don't recommend a lot of alcohol or smoking. I do use medications and supplements, but they're not the main way of prevention. It's lifestyle. Here's what I do recommend. A low-carb diet. Start with 100 grams of carbs per day and get lower and lower until you find a good threshold for you. CGM. What does that stand for? Continuous glucose monitor. It's not until our generation that we've been able to see on a regular basis this most important driver of health, both indicator and driver, and that is your blood sugar. I do recommend that you avoid vegetable oils. I recommend that you consume your micronutrients from your diet to the extent possible. I recommend exercise, and again, it's more than just jogging or walking. It's resistance training and HIIT training, high-intensity interval training, and it's lower body. It's not so much getting biceps, it's lower body. I often use low-dose statins if you have plaque. If you don't, we're not paternalistic. You're Luke Skywalker. We're Yoda. We're just here to help you in your fight with cardiovascular disease risk. We do use metformin for patients that want it. And we do use some anti-diabetic and blood pressure medications. I do recommend improving your sleep. That's a long story and set of details. I recommend managing stress, avoiding environmental toxins, and testing for plaque. Now, I get this question all the time. Okay, doc, you don't like cereal, but what about oatmeal? I don't think all cereals are bad. Most of them are, and the problem is we as a culture eat a lot of cereals. Everywhere, from breakfast to buns and breads. And again, you can consider those cereals. It's grain products, highly, all of processed grain products. Here's the thing. Tony the Tiger's got an ad campaign out there. It's not enough for him to ruin our health with breakfast. Now he wants dinner too.
When I say cereal, you say dinner. Cereal. Dinner. Cereal. Dinner.
Don't let Tony the Tiger take over your dinner. All of which oatmeal, it depends on the amount of processing. I used to keep another little demonstration here at my desk where it showed the difference between instant oats, which are flat flakes, which can be immediately cooked, immediately eaten, and immediately turned into sugar, versus steel-cut oats, which are little balls. They're not flat flakes. They're little kernels. They look like BBs. It takes 30 minutes to cook them, and it takes a long time for your body to turn them into sugar. I eat steel-cut oats. I think they're fine. And if you don't believe me, test it for yourself. Eat a bowl of instant oatmeal. Test your blood sugar before and after. Then eat a bowl of steel-cut oats and test your blood sugar before and after. Again, tell us in the comments if you want us to talk more about that in a future video. Now, if you've made it this far, I really appreciate your interest. I appreciate your focus on your health. I'm going to say it one more time. Cholesterol is the worst lie ever said for food industries, for big pharma. Now, after watching this video, you know that it's not the real driver of heart attacks and strokes. I practice what I preach, and that got me to reverse my own arterial plaque. You can see how that happened in this video right here.